Hello everyone and welcome to another video. In my last video I made RollerCoaster Tycoon 2 a lot more difficult by exploding anyone who thinks a negative thought. But what if we made it easier instead? For example, what if guests spawned 10 times faster than usual? What kind of crazy shenanigans can we do with this enabled? To make this work, I changed two things here. First, I made the probability that the guest spawns 10 times higher. But then, in order to keep up with the extra guests, I also made it so that every ride attracts 10 times more guests. So, a merry-go-round now attracts 450 guests to the park instead of just 45. And the Giga Coaster attracts a massive 1200 guests. This is massively overpowered. For example, usually if you place a single swinging ship down in say Factory Capers and just let it run, you get to maybe 50 guests and not much more. If you do this in our modified version, you can get to over 500 guests with just this single ride. This all sounds pretty perfect, but it's not entirely without issues, and to see how this all plays out, let's do a playthrough of Electric Fields, and after that maybe even go more extreme. When we start up the park, even without doing anything, we're already getting a lot of guests, as there already is a boat hire and a balloon stall in the park. If we charged for the park entrance, we would be making absolute bank right now, but in Electric Fields we charge for the ride, so money will be a bit less plentiful despite all the guests. After having built the customary merry-go-round, it is time for a coaster, and during the construction of that wooden coaster we already hit the goal of 700 guests, just half a month in. Of course, these guest goals are stupidly easy now, so instead of aiming for 700 guests, I'm going to aim for 7,000 guests, 10 times as much. By the way, if you want to see me try fun challenges and stuff like this live, you should check out my Twitch channel. I stream twice a week on Sunday and Wednesday at 8 PM Central European time, and it's always a lot of fun. I usually play RollerCoaster Tycoon 2, but sometimes I play different games as well. Check it out via the link in the description, and I hope to see you there. As the guests keep streaming in, one obvious problem is overcrowding. With just a few rides, this park is not built to handle over 1,000 guests, yet that is already what we have. This will make everyone unhappy, so at some point we will need to hire a whole bunch of entertainers to counteract that. In the meantime, we keep building rides to make some money to afford all those entertainers and to give the guests something to do. After I built a mini roller coaster, something really interesting happened. This bit of path is 4 tiles wide, but guests don't spread evenly across it. Instead, they walk on 2 out of the 4 lanes. However, a short while after opening the mini coaster, all the guests switch from one of the middle lanes to the other outside lane, even if they are not heading for that coaster at all. The sudden connection of that roller coaster to the other side of the 4 tile wide path changes the way that the pathfinding algorithm handles the big plaza, and we saw that in action here. It is now nearly May and we're approaching 2,000 guests, but the park rating isn't looking so great. It is still above the required 600, but not by very much. We're losing a lot of park rating from unhappy guests. The maximum rating you can get from guest happiness is 500, but we are only getting about 200. If it gets worse, we will need to hire more entertainers to forcibly inject even more happiness into the guests, but for now we're still doing okay. One of the reasons that the overcrowding isn't as bad as it could be is that as quickly as the guests are entering the park, they are also leaving it. Already over 1,000 guests have left the park because they can't find anything to do. If a guest hasn't been on a ride yet 5 minutes after they entered the park and can't find a suitable one to head for, they will leave and go home. With most queue lines being full all the time, it's really hard to go on a ride, so most guests will quickly leave the park again. But screw all that, I want more guests, so it's time to pull out the advertisements. Of course, these also generate 10 times more guests, so these will roughly double the amount of guests generated, and it'll be truly insane. And insane it is. Just look at the constant stream of guests heading for the park. With this we should easily get to the 7,000 guests we need, but to get there we will need to build more rides, such as this mine ride. The layout of this ride doesn't really matter as long as it's got a decent throughput, as all it needs to do is allow more guests to go on some kind kind of ride in order to stay in the park and also make us a little bit of money. During the construction of the mine ride it starts to rain, and with over 3,000 guests in the park this is the perfect time to make tons and tons of money with $20 umbrellas. Just look at how many suckers are emptying their wallet just to not get wet. In a very short while we make a few $1,000s in profit from umbrellas, and this is only the beginning. The rain will return stronger and better than ever later in this video. The very overcrowding that makes this profit possible is now also killing our park rating, and it has dropped below 600, so it's finally time to hire more entertainers. I think 60 is enough for now, as we can't really afford any more than that. It actually probably won't be quite enough to make everyone happy, but it should be enough to increase the park rating at least a little bit. You know what the perfect ride is for an overcrowded park like this? A tiny death maze. It can process over 10,000 guests per hour, and guests don't even have to wait in a queue line. And on top of that, it also gives the beautiful sound and sight of a constant stream of dying guests. Ah, beautiful. I could listen to this all day long and be the happiest man on earth. Yeah, that's good. Oh, sorry, I was daydreaming a bit. I should probably give this maze an exit path if I want to reach the goal of 7,000 guests. During this brief moment of bliss, our park rating took an absolute nosedive all the way to 0, which causes the natural guest generation to pretty much dry up entirely. It'll take about half a year for this to fully recover, so until then advertisements are our main source of guests. When August turns into September we hit 5,000 guests for the second time. We briefly got there before, but then I lost myself in the death maze, and in turn we lost a few hundred guests from drowning. No big deal. In the normal game, it's really quite tricky to get to 5,000 guests in say 3 years, yet here we did it with very suboptimal play in about 3/4 of 1 year. It shouldn't be surprising, considering guests do spawn 10 times faster, yet when I actually played it I was still a bit thrown off by how incredibly well it worked. The park is developing very nicely with the addition of some new coasters, and we really quickly went from making less than 10,000 from ride tickets a month to nearly 30,000. This extra money will allow us to build some really nice and big roller coasters, starting with this looping coaster. I didn't really have any plan with this, except I just wanted to make it big and give it a lot of trains. I did unintentionally do something really cool though, and that is that the interlocking loops are perfectly timed in test mode. It looks lovely, but when we open it the trains will need to wait for the guests to board, making this no longer work. After having built a big scary wooden coaster as well, the time has come for the first year to end, and just before that happens we hit our new goal of 7,000 guests. We did 10 times the goal in less than half the time, which I think nicely shows off how incredibly powerful this is. I did keep playing for a little bit after that, and in April year 2 it started to rain again, and the profits are positively insane. In just one in-game week we made about 50,000 euros from selling just umbrellas, more than we ever made from rides in a month. But what if we actually tried to get as many guests as possible and make as much profit as we can? How many guests could we get and how much money could we make? This is the build your own Six Flags park scenario, and I'm gonna see how quickly I can get to 15,000 guests, again 10 times the original goal. To do this I will build as many tiny corkscrew coasters as possible. Immediately after I open the first one the guests start flowing in, and this won't ever stop, especially after we also build some stalls and run all advertisements. With this handy pre-built design that includes path I can really quickly just build dozens and dozens of these little rides. At the end of March we have built 48 of them and we're already making absolute bank. With nearly 3,000 guests in the park our ride profit is well over 30,000 in the first month. Usually you charge for the park entry in this scenario, but I changed it to rides because that scales up better once you get a lot of guests. With a ride ticket price of €7.40 for each of these we will become a millionaire in no time. At the start of April I hired 400 entertainers to keep the guests happy, before building another 48 of these tiny rides in the same pattern as before. I'm leaving some space in between the grids so that we can build stalls there. Obviously we'll need a lot of cash machines, and food stalls are also a necessity. The other stuff isn't strictly necessary, but it still helps. As the end of April is nearing we already have over 6,500 guests in the park and suddenly more than €100,000 in the bank. And this is reflected in the the finances window. It's only the second month and we've already made over 173,000 euros in ride profit. This is completely insane and still just the beginning. In May we do the exact same thing again. We built a third set of 48 micro corkscrew coasters and placed plenty of stalls in between so that our guests can remain satisfied. We will get guests a bit slower now as we have hit the 7,000 mark. If you have over 7,000 guests in the park, the natural guest generation slows down by 75%. In the original game you will rarely get this many guests, and this was probably done to prevent you from hitting the sprite limit. But with the increased limits in OpenRCT 2, it is quite a bit easier to get 7,000 guests. With this reduction of the natural guest generation, now most of our guests are coming from the ads, which are unaffected by it, so we're still getting plenty of new guests and we don't have to worry. At the end of May we are closing in on 10,000 guests really quite quickly. In addition, we also have made over 300,000 euros from ride tickets, which is just baffling. The park value is also already over 3 million, which is incredibly high, much higher than the highest park value goal in the entire game. Another month later, at the end of June, we have hit 12,000 guests and we've made over 400,000 euros in profit from rides. We are getting quite close to our goal of 15,000 guests now. The next month we built a few more rides until we have a total of 224 of these corkscrew coasters. They are making so much cold hard cash that we are about to become a millionaire. Again, as with before, I know that we are getting guests 10 times quicker and I know that it's gonna be insane, but I still didn't expect this level of insanity. €1 million less than 5 months in, I never expected that, but here it happened. Shortly after, in the beginning of August, we hit our self-imposed goal of 15,000 guests, 10 times the goal in less than a sixth of the allotted time of 4 years. But we can go even more extreme. This time I made it so that every single game tick a guest spawns, no matter what. There are 40 ticks in a second, so this means we get a constant stream of 40 new guests every single second, which is 2400 a minute. If you charge for the park entrance, this allows you to make absolutely insane money. In Leafy Lake, guests spawn with at least 60 euros, and with charging that we make nearly $1 million a month from the park entrance. It's even better if you combine it with last video's mod that makes guests explode whenever they think a negative thought. Everyone immediately thinks that it's too crowded, so this just gives you a constant stream of exploding guests. Just like the drowning guests earlier, this really is music to my ears and I'm in absolute bliss when listening to this. If you enjoyed this as much as I did, you can click here to see how the exploding guests impacted the building of a normal park. Thank you all for watching and I will see you in the next video.